You're here from the Institute for Social Accountability and Zetsewere, development economist. Wanjiro, let me start with you because health is a devolved function. What do you think of this? And are the county and national governments speaking with each other?
I think you've hit the nail on the head, and Dr. Oluga also said it, the two big issues, and there could be three. One is the issue of the intergovernmental relations in terms of health. We've seen that play out through the strike process and the difficulty in mediating and resolving what really should have been an issue that should have been brought to a close much earlier. This is really about the resistance to devolve, partly by the unions themselves. You know, the national government also seemed to play a role in terms of fueling this resistance. The other thing is governance. Dr. Oluga said it. There was 45 billion, I believe, that was spent on special equipment that was supposed to go to all the counties. Now, a lot of this equipment, some of this equipment landed. By now, maybe all of it has. We don't know. But the counties then turned around and said, one, we were not consulted. Number two, it was overpriced. Three, we are then going to pay for something that that's not in our plan. It's not in our needs. So this, you know, the poor governance around this and policy disconnects. In fact, the scary thing is when government gets into project mode and starts doing things that sound very attractive, because it sounds fantastic. Let's equip 47 counties with specialist equipment. You haven't told us where the medical personnel are, where the maintenance costs are going to, you know, going to be supported from, how you're going to run this equipment. So we're getting a lot of projects like this, and you know, it's more of the tenderpreneur government that we're
so big projects
we're worried about. Yes.
All right, and Zetse, what do you think of the Big Four action plan? Health is one of them. Wanjiro says, you know, we're focused on big projects that sound very attractive. What do you think of this? Because not only is it part of the budget for the coming fiscal year, it's a 5-year strategy plan.
That's right. I think one of the overall concerns people have had about the Big Four is what was the rationale behind their selection in the first place. We have not really been given a compelling argument as to what the rationale was. So that's one. I think the second big issue of concern for me as an economist is that there's no fiscal support for this strategy. If you look at the allocations for the Big Four and the current budget policy statement, they are no different to what government was doing before. So agriculture will get about 2.3%, health will get about 3.8%, infrastructure will get about 23%, but when they break down how infrastructure is going to be spent, there's no section saying that this is how we're going to change the allocation to emphasize housing. And then, of course, manufacturing and industrialization is in sort of the general and commercial affairs, which gets about 1%. So if you look at the trend government has been having over the past 5 years in terms of allocations, we're not seeing a strategic shift in that allocation to resource the Big Four. So that's
even
really,
in the budget policy
in the budget policy statement released last year,
in January, which they say is realigned to the Big Four.
No, what they do in the budget policy statement is they say what they're going to do in the Big Four. So there's a whole section in the BPS around this is what we want to do. But when you look at the numbers in terms of fiscal support, it's not there, as far as I can see. If you look at the trends before this year, this fiscal year, if you look at the trends in the budget policy statement going forward, the allocation are pretty constant. There's no strategic shift. There's no rationale being presented as to why that shift isn't happening. So we're not really seeing the Big Four being resourced the way that it should be. Now, part of the argument may be that some of it is a devolved function, but there still should be some sort of strategic resourcing that should be happening. The other thing just is the scale of financing that's going on there. If you look at agriculture, for example, Kenya is part of the Maputo Declaration that says about 10% of the national budget should go to agriculture. We're sitting at about 2.3 to 3%. Same thing with healthcare. We're under-resourced in terms of what our peers are doing in Africa and what we've committed as a government of Kenya. So really the resourcing isn't there.
Okay, when we want to talk about, you know, what's happening with the Big Four agenda, it's talking a lot about public-private partnerships. What are your thoughts, Wanjiro, with respect to this? Because the president recently met the IFC talking about how this is going to be financed largely by the private sector.
You know, this Big Four I was trying to think, how do you put this very simply? It's like a car. Development is a development plan, which is what the BPS is like a car. You want it to take us from where we are to the future we aspire to. Now, this car is very glossy because this big four sounds very attractive. But when you come to the tires that are supposed to drive the car, they're flat. Because these sectors in which government has prioritized growth, a growth trajectory, does not have the required intergovernmental relations. Okay. So either the government has decided devolution is no longer a priority. Of course, it hasn't. It's made statements for devolution. But the BPS contradicts itself because these pillars are not anchored in the devolved government. I'll give you an example, manufacturing. If you look at trade at local level, counties are responsible for trade at local level. So if you're talking about trade and industrialization, you'd expect the counties then to become a hub. So policy is being set up there. National government's looking at national level trade and regional level trade. But counties are the ones that are supposed to be growing the trade at based on their comparative advantage, whether it's the agro-processing, whether it's going into steel manufacturing, whatever it is, at the local level. Now, the trade policy developed in 2016 correctly recognizes that you need an intergovernmental mechanism. And it says this and it elaborates on how this would work and what sectors would come together so that national government can talk to itself and talk to counties and respect the functional mandates. Now, the BPS is oblivious. Whoever sat to write this didn't even consult within government itself. So these are projects and they seem pulled out, they're good projects, but they don't seem to have a context. So they don't have the fiscal financing. According to what Anzetse is saying, I would say they don't have the legs on which to run because they don't have the policy grounding. Okay. The other, of course, problem with this car, this development vehicle, is the governance then is very weak. So you have
and we will come to that because governance is a key issue in terms of this whole process. Yeah. Public-private partnership?
Well, from my view, we're getting into public-private partnerships because we're in an incredibly tight fiscal space. If you look at sort of our debt being accrued, I think we're sitting at about 60% debt to GDP ratio right now with aggressive borrowing going on forward. So I think government has realized, and you'll see several references in the budget policy statements around high-speed BPS, specialized PPPs, and all these sorts of things. It's because of the tight fiscal space they're in. They're beginning to understand that debt is becoming a bit of a problem. They've had multiple warnings, and we can get into that a bit later, from all the major development finance institutions. If you look at our credit ratings, everybody's concerned about our vulnerability to debt. So government is sort of looking at how can we resource this big four, and how can we resource all the other plans that we have when we don't really have the money to resource it to the extent that we wanted. And that's why public-private partnerships are becoming a big deal. The main problem with PPPs is the capacity to actually take up those projects, particularly by the domestic private sector, hasn't really been worked on. Government itself struggles with getting the technocrats because it's incredibly complex deals that last, over 10 years plus. So you have to get the financing right. So I think sort of talking about public-private partnerships is great, but if you're not doing the capacity building, particularly for the domestic private sector to take up that, and that includes the financing of it, then you're just going to talk about PPPs and it's not really going to pick up,
Okay, but there's another aspect on the PPPs. Because PPPs, and there's a very good report on this by the ODI, Overseas Development Institute. PPPs, because it's corporate financing, actually widen the distance between citizen and government in terms of accountability because it takes a corporate approach, especially if it's not designed properly. The other concern I have with PPPs is the idea that a big project is what's needed to resolve that problem. For instance, we're talking about environment, it's a big issue. Solid waste management, big issue. Do you go for one huge mega recycling plant, do a PPP, or you decentralize and do many small recycling plants, create more jobs, have closer accountability in terms of creating, setting up those recycling plants and how they link to neighborhoods. So we also have to interrogate the rationale, or rather the philosophy behind Vision 2030, behind this BPS, which assumes that private finance is the
solution,
is the panacea.
is the silver bullet?
Because sometimes the problem is actually in there's a big social component that also needs to be brought on board.
Okay.
May I just say that
yes,
there are provisions for PPPs at county government level.
Yeah.
So that is really one of the key ways, particularly with the devolved function. If you're looking at water and waste management, if you're looking at housing as well, you will find that counties actually have the right to get into public-private partnerships. But again, the same issues, the capacity issues, counties don't have that technical skill and ability, and domestic private sector isn't really being engaged. So while the provisions are there, we don't have the actual mechanisms to make sure that those PPPs are absorbed at county level.
And we reviewed the county procurement guidelines around the PPPs. And one of the things that we noted is that there's inadequate public participation, there's inadequate transparency, there's inadequate accountability.
Okay, now, on the issue of public participation, let's just, I want to take you through what the budget cycle looks like, and that'll be running as we have the conversation. Important to note that these are the 4 big processes, and this is thanks to the guys at the International Budget Partnerships. They have some great information as to just understanding the whole budget cycle in this country. The key most important processes in the cycle: formulation, approval, implementation, and audit and oversight. And remember, all of this happens almost concurrently throughout the cycle, even as we start to formulate the budget for the coming financial year. There's still accounting that is happening for the current financial year that we're in. And we're at that point, I think, at the tail end of this fiscal year, which is where counties are publishing their implementation reports. So is the national government, and the budget proposals are being submitted to the National Assembly. You talked about public participation, Wanjiru. Are we adequately involved in this whole budget cycle? Do we understand it?
I don't like being a pessimist and saying all the negative things, but we were particularly unhappy with the way this process was managed. The national budget process, of course, kicks off with the budget circular, which gives guidelines on how the budget will be managed.
Right.
And then the BPS comes soon after that, because this is the annual plan. Now, the BPS is a derivative of the 5-year plan, which is supposed to be the MTP3.
Yes.
Because we're under the Vision 2030, that's our long-term plan, and then we have 5-year plans.
Yeah.
Now, the MTP process started out, of course, there was a prolonged electioneering, which affected the budget-making process because of the questions over legitimacy. Could this government, could the president continue engaging during the contestation? So the MTP3 process started.
Which is the medium-term
plan 3 to break down Vision 2030 into a 5-year plan.
Yes. Okay.
Started out and then went underground as it waited. Now we're on some, we actually petitioned a couple of the sector working groups, and we got no notification. And we've been calling around saying, when are you restarting?
Yeah.
When are we going to sit down and discuss the plans you have for trade and development, for environmental? Because that's where you do the negotiation. Planning is extremely important because that's where decisions are made. And that's the problem we are having. We are having documents that are, almost predetermined. And then at implementation stage, you sometimes then have other sets of priorities coming in. So yes, there is public participation in that the public are invited to give their views, but those views then are not taken on board because the decision has already been made.
So that's the quality of public participation.
In
so
this
it's
case,
not just
in this case, there was even problems with timelines. Even institutions like the IEA that monitor the budget refused to engage in the BPS process because there was like 3 days. I think it was uploaded on Friday, and the feedback was due in on the next Wednesday. And it's a huge document that you need to internalize. And then it was only uploaded. So if you weren't checking, you wouldn't have known. And the advert, I think, went out on Tuesday or something. So the notification was extremely short. And then it happened at the same time the sector hearings were happening. Sector hearings are where the sectors will review a bit of what has happened and will also say what they plan to do, and they're a very important avenue for public participation. So no, the sovereignty of the people is not cannot be expressed in a process that's closed timelines are short, and the decisions seem to have been made because there's a big four agenda that doesn't seem open to negotiation, whereas it could be.
That's interesting, yeah.
It could be.
And I think the other issue with this whole process and cycle is that you've got the budget policy statement, and then what's actually read is not the same thing. So when you look at the way the BPS is formulated, when you're looking at the sort of expenditure that's expected, the revenue generation that's expected, and then the debt that we're getting into, they're typically not exactly what's said later on. If you look at the expenditure, it usually goes up. If you look at the revenue generation, it usually goes down because we never hit our targets.
Yeah.
So if you look at the debt, we're always going to borrow more than what we had said in the BPS. So one of the problems with the BPS is that it gives you a bit of a pulse, but you're not getting very specific information in terms of what's going to actually happen. Now, the second stage that's the problem is the actual implementation, where supplementary budgets come in all the time, where things are being shifted, particularly around development and recurrent expenditure, where sort of promises for austerity that are often made year after year after year, we're going to go into austerity, are then sort of sidelined and forgotten through all these supplementary budgets. So by the time you're looking at the implementation and the end figures, it looks nothing like what was said in the budget policy statement or what was announced by the CS. So that's part of the problem. Is it's quite difficult to track because of those supplementary budgets and the way money keeps on being shifted around. And even the way the budget is tabulated and the updates are given are not necessarily in a manner where you can track budget line by budget line. Sometimes you're not clear whether this has shifted from this side to that side. So often the process of implementation then makes it difficult to track from what was said in the first place.
Okay, interesting. And Zetse Wanjiru, stay with me here on Checkpoint as we take a look at the budget proposals that have been made. That's in the budget policy statement. And where we are, Kenya's economy, what needs to happen. We'll be talking solutions and what we think needs to happen. Of course, we'll also be talking about Kenya's debt crisis and another Eurobond. And Zetse Wanjiru will be weighing in on that in just a moment here on Checkpoint. Taking a break, we'll be right back.